Okay, so it's being recorded now. So am I still screen sharing? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed, Martin, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing. And you know, we wouldn't have a Galway genetic genealogy project if it wasn't for all of the hard work and the organization you're doing in Galway. So what I'd like to do today is talk about specific case studies in my family. These are people from Galway who, and one specific case, who migrated in chain, I suppose, in mass. The entire family migrated to Southern California. And we'll tell the story about them. What was their condition when they left? What happened to them when they arrived in the US? And what happened to the first and second generation after that. Just a little bit of background about myself, and I'm going to take the pictures away. Sorry, here, this is fine. So my day job is in innovation and research partnerships. I've been working in technology for over 40 years. I'll be retiring soon, which will give me time to dedicate to the other things which I'm interested in, right? And I'll tell you a few of those things. I'm on the IEEE, which is the Engineers Association, the Irish Society of Human Genetics, and this is mainly the academic community in Ireland, which works in the population genetics area, and more it's going into the healthcare area. About 15 years ago, I set up the ISOGG group in Ireland, and we have a very active community in Ireland now. There are over 7,000 members of the Irish diaspora, probably 7,500 now, who are on ISOGG and the Genetic Genealogy Ireland pages. I'm on the patient advisory board of Genealogy Science. Genealogy Science is the largest genome company in Ireland, and they sequence genomes for healthcare purposes. I'm on the board of Georgia Ireland Business Council, and as part of my work for the last 5 years was doing smart and sustainable cities and communities. I'm on the board of Sandyford Business District and the task force of Smart Dublin, Smart Auckland, Smart Sandyford, Smart Belfast, and Digital Delivery. So that they are sort of things, they're pro bono work I do outside of my day job, but which is somehow related to technology and smart cities. And I've been nominated to the Strategic Climate Change Committee in our local council. And on the A side, I'm co-administrator of Genetic Genealogy Ireland, DNA Outreach Ireland, the Irish Midlands DNA Project, and the Galway DNA Project. And apart from those, I do my own personal Corcoran DNA project. And recently we have set up the Sarsfield DNA project as part of the Patrick Sarsfield Homecoming. So that's a quick overview. And so what do we do in, well, what is my focus in ISOGG Ireland at the moment? These are multi-year projects, and they may not have an end, but they certainly have a beginning and they have a middle. And I don't suppose any DNA or any genealogy project has an end. So I'm looking at, you know, we look at the evolution of genetic genealogy in Ireland. There are several regional projects in Ireland, in Munster, Leinster, Ulster, and Connacht, and we have more specific county ones like Donegal and Leitrim. We have Galway, we have County Clare, there's County Cork, there's Waterford, and so on and so forth. And we're constantly, and I suppose our ambition would be to have at least a genealogy project in every county in Ireland. And we do surname and SNP analysis, and we do genetic genealogy. Excuse me just 1 minute. I'm going to tidy up something else. Okay. Right. Yeah. The other thing I'm looking at a lot is Celtic migrations or ancient DNA and ancient population genetics. So where did we originally come from? The Indo-European, the evolution from the steppe herders, the Amnea tribes, the Caucasus region, the migration west into fusion with the Belbeaker, migration north into the Isles, into Ireland. And then all of the inbound and outbound migrations of Ireland, like the Vikings coming in, the Normans coming in, the Huguenots, the Palatines, the Victorian and Georgian Ireland, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, a major project I'm interested in the Irish reference genome. And so this means tracking every single population genetic study which is published, looking at the implications for that on Irish DNA, vendor population genetics, and citizen science engagement. I think there's a potential to collect DNA samples from reference samples from each of the parishes in Ireland. There are about 2,500 parishes, and to get a more granular view of the DNA of Ireland. Currently, we're probably at the province level, so province or county level, Munster, Leinster, Ulster, and Connacht, and then maybe a little bit more granularity into certain specific areas. And then finally is looking at technology applied to genetic genealogy. And this has been looking at big data, artificial intelligence. And I suppose the next thing we've been hearing a lot about recently is the metaverse, and how do you apply that to genetic genealogy projects. Okay, so everyone's doing DNA testing, and it has been increasing exponentially. Actually, 2017 was a year of inflection when tests took off and they started to go exponential, and we see that about 60% of people are interested in what origins they have, and another 25% are interested in matches and breaking down barriers in their genealogy trees, and about 15% are interested in healthcare and wellness related issues, and that would be reflected in the 23andMe types of community. The big four are Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. I've tested with about 15 different direct-to-consumer testing companies. Some of the smaller ones there would be Living DNA, which is specialized in the Isles. The Genographic project, which started everything off, but it's now completed its mission, and they're no longer recruiting new. It's no longer an active project, but this was how many of us got started about 15 years ago. The Helix, which is platform-based on the Illumina platform. You have Dante Labs in Italy, which do full genomes. You have ISOGG in Germany, who do specific high-quality STR tests. You have Full Genomes, who do full genome sequencing of the Y chromosome. You have Nebula Genetics, which is based on George Church's work in the USA and the Personal Genome Project and things like that. You have YFull, which is more of the analytics. You have GEDmatch, of course, which many of us use, and it accepts uploads from most of the major DNA companies. And then you have the new entrants, the national programs. These are precision medicine driven programs like Genomics England. In Ireland, it's Genuity Science, and their mission is to sequence about 40,000 full genomes of Irish people, and this is mainly for healthcare reasons. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how this all applies to the Irish diaspora. We have, we have about 5 million people here in Ireland, but there are about 80,000 people of Irish heritage, throughout the world, 40 million of those in the USA. You have people in Australia and South Africa, in New Zealand, in South America, in Argentina, many in Europe now. And these not only go back to the 19th century or 18th century, but further beyond. You can find the wild geese in the 17th century who went to fight the wars of Europe, and even 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, you had the Irish monastic movement, and there was a lot of educational movement between Ireland and the continent. So, and we do have a lot of Irish presidents who had Irish heritage. About over half of US presidents had some form of Irish heritage, whether it be on the paternal, on the maternal side. A great many of these come from the Ulster, what we call the Scots-Irish tradition, and they may have been Presbyterian, and they migrated. They came from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and then they went from Northern Ireland on to the US, and this would have been in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Of course, the Great Movement was because of the Irish Great Famine in the 19th century. So the more recent presidents, you have Biden. He has ancestry in Louth and in County Mayo. Before him, you had Barack Obama, whose maternal ancestry came from County Offaly in Shinrone. You had Ronald Reagan, his ancestry came from Tipperary, and Jimmy Carter, and so on and so forth. So you have a mix of both sides of the house. And the famous one, of course, was JFK, and his ancestry came from Wexford, and probably before there from Ormond in Lower Ormond in Tipperary, and they would have originated the Kennedys, County Clare type area. So yeah, so a lot of interesting stories behind each of these presidents, and eventually I'm sure we will get around to doing a detailed genealogy, and hopefully eventually do some DNA analysis. So if you look at the entire diaspora, 80 million people, they've left their mark in many countries in the world. There's a very good exhibit in Ireland, which I was involved in the setting up in. It's called ISOGG Ireland. It is one of the best tourist destination in Ireland, in Europe award for the last 3 years. And it tells the stories of many of these people. Some of them, which I'm deeply involved in at the moment, are the wild geese and the wind geese. And these were the Irish soldiers who fought in the European wars after the Battle of the Boyne, the Battle of Corcoran, the Treaty of Limerick. They left Ireland, maybe 100,000 left. In total, over the centuries, probably 1 million people left, and these people can be traced abroad now. But again, each of these is a story, and each of them has worked developing their genealogy, and genetic genealogy is a powerful tool in helping us to identify and to tell the stories of these people. And about this time is the 175th anniversary of Dunmore, or the Great Hunger. This was our Holocaust, and I don't want to demean the word Holocaust, but for us it was a national tragedy, and it explains, it's the background which pushed a lot of people to emigrate from Ireland to find a better life in the new world and in America. And the story which I will tell today is about one such family who was caught in the middle of Dunmore, who had to leave, and the entire family left, and how their life evolved when they reached the promised land. So a little background by myself. Earlier Martin showed his ancestry. Mine is also the same. It's definitely Connacht. and it's definitely Galway, but more specifically, Ancestry says that I'm on the border of Galway, Roscommon and Mayo. So if you zoom in there, you will come to a town called Dunmore, and there are lots of townlands around Dunmore, and some of them are named here. And this is based on, I think they used a cohort of 1.7 million people totally, and to do my particular analysis, they're comparing me to over 500,000 Ancestry DNA members. So it's a good cohort. It has good granularity. It has good precision, and it brings me into these townlands, and all of these townlands I'm familiar with: Kildappa, Gurchin, Dunmore, Kildamaddy, Ballinlough, Castlereagh, Clunfad, Garifons, pretty much circling around Dunmore. And this is on my maternal side. More on my maternal side migrated. That was mainly because probably on poorer lands was a mixture of bog and pasture lands, whereas on my paternal side they had good farmland in North Tipperary. There wasn't so much migration from that side. So definitely my maternal side is defining my matching, my DNA communities and ancestry. And if we have a look at the left, it's showing the clusters I belong to under Ancestry DNA, and on the right these are all of the townlands where members of my ancestry lived, and many emigrated from these areas. And we'll hear a lot about Kilnilappa, Clunfad. We will hear a lot about Gurchin. So if we have a look at, let me get the pointer on this working properly. Excuse me. Okay, I've got the laser here. So I think this is me and my mum and my grandmother, who was born in 1879, and her mother was Mary Mannion, and her father was Patrick Donlan. So they were Donlans. That was Nora Donlan, or they were called Honora in those days, but very often Nora and Honora were the same. And then we come to Bridget Reddington, William Mannion. So we had Mannions, we had Donlan, and we had Nellie Geraghty. And Nellie Geraghty is a very exceptional woman, because I've identified maybe 1,000 of her descendants. So many stories go back, and they originate with Nellie Geraghty, and many of her descendants were forced into immigration, and we will find the different names, the Mannions and the Reddingtons and Keavenys throughout our history. And in this case, I use all of the testing companies. I use FTDNA, I use Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, 23andMe, as well as the various subscription in MyHeritage, in Ancestry DNA for record searching. And today I'll sort of focus a little bit on MyHeritage, because they had some interesting tools which were quite useful to me. One of them is instant discoveries, so that if excuse me, if they feel that through your DNA matches and through your other matches, they will develop smart matches for you. These would have been matches which would have been difficult to find, and which helped me fill in quite a lot of gaps and brick walls in my genealogy development. As you know, in Ireland, 100 years ago, the Records Office burned down. It was on the opening salvo of the Civil War, the greatest act of what would you call it? I don't know, destruction, probably in the history of the country. Anyway, we lost 700 years of records, and the people in Trinity College are trying to restore a lot of those through the project beyond 2022. So they're recreating a virtual treasury office, and they're recreating backups to many of those records which were lost through replication in Crony in Northern Ireland, or in the records office in London, or in private estates around the country. So the instant discoveries and DNA matches are very, very useful. And of course, you get source matches as well, so that each of the entries on my tree have multiple sources, and it's a good way to keep track of all of these sources. So we looked at one small, if you remembered, back at my great-grandmother was a Mannion, and she was from Gurchin, or Gurchin Bon, it means white Gurchin. Gurchin means a small field. And so I've managed to map out a lot of people in the Mannion family. And one of the, my ancestors was Gerty. We had Nellie Gerty, but we also had the Gertys of Gurchin. And we managed to, Aoife Gerty has written a book, quite a large book, which tells the entire story of the Gertys and the related families. So I'm very much indebted to Aoife for that. So we find a lot of them, the Mannions around Gurchin. We find Carntrolla, this was the big house, and every town had a big house. In this case, it was the Hancocks who were the landlords. There was a bit of notoriety about this family. There were the Gertys and Lizzie Connor. There's the Keavenys in Boyna, and my great-grandmother was a Keaveny. There were the Gilmores in Lettra. There were, again, the Gertys of Cluncrun West, and so on and so forth. And we see other families who are related. Again, all of these are in East Galway area. So we'll have a look at Bridget. The focus of this will be Bridget Donlan. Bridget was a granddaughter of, she was the daughter, excuse me, of Nellie Gerty, or Ellen Gerty, and she had married Michael, Nellie Gerty married Michael Donlan, and they had daughter Bridget, and Bridget had married a Fox, someone who was called Fox, and he died, and she married a Nolan, and for various reasons, different members of the family interchangeably used the name Fox, which was the original parent, or Nolan, and sometimes Fox Nolan. So we will come across the use of this. And they had a large family, over 10 children, but we will focus in on Celia and Nora. And this is Bridget here, and she married Thomas Nolan Fox, and they had over 10 children, and each of them were married. Some married when they went to the States, when they emigrated to the States, and others married after that. And we will see the progression of all of these, particularly focusing on Celia and Nora. So these are some of the children of Bridget. James Fox married Nora Mullaney, and they settled eventually in Southern California. Delia Nolan married William Banning. So again, we see that there's interchangeable between Fox and Nolan. One of the siblings used the name Fox, used Nolan, and Delia married William Banning, and William was in the fire service, and he was also a policeman, and they settled down in Venice in California. So this is Bridget, and Bridget stayed in Ireland until 1899. Her earliest children migrated in the 1880s, and it was a type of serial migration. They initially went to New York, and then the first of the children settled in Cincinnati and stayed there. And then they would send back the fare to the next child, and that child would come. They would go to New York, then on to Cincinnati, and then the first of those went on to Southern California. So the end destination was Southern California, with the halfway house being in Cincinnati. So we find the Donlans and the Foxes and the Nolans in Cincinnati, but the majority of them settled in Southern California. By the time that Bridget migrated, she was 60 years old. So she needed special permission and special dispensation to be allowed to enter, which was provided because all of her children had already settled in the United States and had built up families and were important people in their community. Bridget never had a permanent address in the US. She would go from daughter to son to daughter to different houses around the United States, and she spent the rest of her life going to each of the children's homes and helping out with the grandchildren and helping out with her family. She was very much beloved by her children and also by her grandchildren. And she was known as a natural psychologist because she instinctively took the side of the in-laws, which is probably a very good strategy in in-law politics. This is the epitaph for there was a book written by one of her granddaughters, Catherine Phelan, and this told the story of their migration to the US. And the main thing was that they kept their faith and their Irish heritage. They kept it very strong when they went to the US. The descendants of Bridget and Thomas had become active in church, community, school, and social affairs. They became librarians, lawyers, teachers, mayors, doctors, druggists, nurses, religious, businessmen, financiers, politicians, and so on and so forth. And these were the professions which are followed to this day by the grandchildren of Bridget. Excuse me. One of the granddaughters of Bridget was Regina Phelan, who settled in Whittier in California, and she wrote a series of about 8 books on the experience of the pioneers arriving in California. At the time the first of these arrived, this was just at the time when California became a state. Some of the big ranches were still held by the previous Spanish-Mexican landlords. Excuse me. And Regina wrote a number of books on these. And these illustrations are taken from her books. This is the blessing on leaving Ireland. Many of us are aware that there was a type of a funeral happened, or a wake happened for the people who were emigrating, and this was the case for most of the people. So these are the various books written by Regina. One was They Came by El Camino. It's the stories of the people who came by wagon train across the deserts and arrived in the across the Sierra Nevada, arrived into California. Talked about Alta California, about the new state of California and the new settlers, and it specifically focused on the families or her ancestors who are one of those who are the descendants of Bridget, Nolan, Fox. Some of them came by way of Panama, so they would arrive maybe in New York, and rather than cross the vast land territory of the US, they would go down, they would sail down to Canada, or maybe from New Orleans, they would sail down to Panama, there was no canal there at the time, but they crossed by mule, and then take a steamer up to, or a sailboat up to San Francisco. And that was how many migrated to California in those days. Others went right around the Horn, which was a treacherous journey of many months, and many didn't make it because there were ships which were shipwrecked on that trail. And then many of them came by wagon train across the El Camino. They crossed the Gila crossing in the Sierra Nevadas, and yeah. So eventually the railroads were built, and many of the Irish worked on those railroads. And once the railroads opened, this increased the number of people migrating to California. And these are some other extracts from Regina Phelan's books. It talks about the hide and tallow trailers. These were the whaling ships, and some of them worked on that. It talks about the cattle drives from Texas. It talks about various ships that they had passage on, like the New Yorker, the Constitution. It talks about crossing of the Gila Pass, the high passes of Sierra Nevadas, and other ships arriving in San Diego from Panama. And eventually the completion of the Trans-Pacific railroads and the opening up of a large-scale migration to California. These are some of the Phelan family. So Anne, who was one of Bridget's daughters, she married Tom Phelan. No, she married Daniel Phelan, and his uncle was Tom Phelan. Both of them set up ranches in Whittier, in California. They initially focused on walnuts, and they had large acreage of walnut plantations. Eventually, when these were wiped out by a particular virulent disease, they converted to citrus fruits. And I can remember when I was a child in Dublin receiving large packages of dried citrus fruits around Christmas time, and these came from descendants of the Phelan family. And there are still schools which are named after the Phelans in Whittier, and their old homestead was built on later by the National School there. A few of the roads and public buildings are named after them. And this is Regina with some of her nieces passing down the stories. She wrote down much of the genealogy, and also kept the history going. Another of the descendants was Nora, and she married Michel Herman in Santa Monica, and Michel and Nora set up a small dairy company. This was the Santa Monica Dairy Company. By the time, by 1887, it had become the largest dairy company in Southern California. They had a fleet of over 100 wagons, whether they were motorized or non-motorized. Initially, they were horse-drawn, and eventually they became motorized. This Santa Monica Dairy Company was converted to the Edgemar farms at a later date by descendants of Herman Michel. And today, the building, which was the dairy company, has been converted into the Public Arts Center of Santa Monica. It was converted by the architect Gerard, so it's a notable protected building in Santa Monica today. Michel, or Herman Michel, he did run for mayor of Santa Monica, and he was elected for 2 terms. So this was in common with some of the other, some of his other in-laws, who also became mayors of their communities. And this again is a photograph of this Santa Monica Dairy Company, and on the right we see it's the Beverly Hills branch, and they have horses, and within 10 years all of the horses were replaced by motorized based on the Model T car. The other daughter married Henry Flynn, and they settled in San Fernando. And Henry again was very much into politics. He founded, he ran for mayor and was elected. And the family set up the Porter Hotel in San Fernando, and this became the center of politics in San Fernando. It was also the embryonic place where the Republican Party in San Fernando was established, and they continued that tradition through many generations. And these are postcards which show the Porter Hotel, which was the largest hotel and restaurant in San Fernando at that time. These are other collections from the Phelans, the Flynns of San Fernando, the Phelans of Whittier, and the Michels of Santa Monica. And they continue the tradition every September. They would get together with children and the grandchildren. So in this case, we have Herman, Michel here, and Nora, and all of these are their siblings or children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. So this became an annual tradition. It started in the early 30s and continued right through to the 1960s. In fact, I can remember when I was a small lad in Dublin, Herman was having his 90th birthday, and they went back to his hometown in Switzerland, and at the same time they went back to Nora's hometown in Ireland, and at that time they passed through Dublin, and it was at that time I met this lady here. This was Catherine Phelan, who was a granddaughter of Bridget, and she wrote the story of the migration of Bridget and her family. And her cousin was Regina Phelan, and Regina took all of those stories and expanded them greatly, but also told the story of the pioneer settlement in Southern California. which is part of the history of Southern California. And this was another picture of the Nolan fox. In 1979, people are getting older, and the clan is getting bigger, and there are more and more young ones in the photographs. So it's quite difficult to recognize people in these, but fortunately on MyHeritage, there's some photographic tools where you can extract the photos, enhance them, and even animate them. So here we have Nora when we restore the photo, and here is Herman. And if you see them back on this photo again, it shows what can be done by photographic restoration. And we did the same exercise with some of the Phelans. This is Annie Phelan and Joe Phelan, who are grandson and granddaughter of Daniel and Annie. So that was the story of the Fox Nolans of Southern California. On my paternal side, again, we researched, this is myself here, my father Thomas, his father Stephen, his father Thomas, his father John, and his father Thomas. And they were based again in East Galway in Clonfert, around Clonfert Cathedral. And a brother of this Thomas in the early 1800s was Michael, and his son was Michael, and his son again was Michael. And this Michael Corcoran, born 1818, he lived in Clonfert. He migrated to the US. They landed in New York. They settled in Minnesota, in Jessenland in Minnesota, which is in Sibley County. And Bill Corcoran, who unfortunately died this year, aged 98, he matched me on FTDNA, and we got talking. I invited the year of the gathering 2013. I invited a group of 20 of them to come back to Ireland. We revisited their town, which was Clonfert. We showed them the old graveyards, and the Irish national TV station, Television na Gaeilge, they made a documentary of this visit. So again, this was Michael Corcoran, who married Mary Corcoran, and their children was John Corcoran and Laura Scully, and they had a number of siblings. James here, and William was a granddaughter of John Corcoran and Catherine Scully. His mother was died in childbirth. William survived, but he was raised by his grandparents. And this was the original Michael who emigrated from Clonfert, and this was John Corcoran, who was the son of Michael. He was the grandfather of William, who came back and visited, and I've developed a family tree there. And these were the various spouses. This was the original Mary Corcoran, who was the spouse of Michael Corcoran there. She also lived in Clonfert, as did Michael. And this is the place. So all of my ancestors are buried along here. This grave here, right in front of the door, is the grave of St. Brendan the Navigator. Now, we heard a few weeks ago that the Vikings did arrive in Newfoundland and discovered, but we maintain that St. Brendan the Navigator settled in the US 1500 years ago, or didn't settle. He arrived there and they made a return journey, but it was documented in a medieval best-selling manuscript, which was The Voyages of Brendan. And this is the grave of Brendan the Navigator. And these are all of the graves of the Corcorans of Clonfert. This is the oldest continuously used place of worship in Ireland. So we brought Bill. So this is Bill. Here I am presenting him his certificate of Irish heritage and showing him the grave of Michael. We also showed him the grave of Michael's grandfather, who was Hugh Corcoran, who was our common ancestor at that time. And these are the group of 20 people from Minnesota who are part of that gathering. And we also explored another branch of our Corcorans. This was related to Maidie Corcoran. I'm not sure if Maidie is on the call. And we did conclude that we were not the same branch. One of my objectives is to identify all of the Corcoran branches. We've identified about 5 so far, and the objective, I think, would be to get to about 10 different separate branches where they came from, where they originated from. And this particular branch were millers. They have about 10 mills in the Galway area. Like my branch, they were originally living in Tipperary, but in Cromwellian times, they were forced west under the penalty to Hell or to Connacht. Some returned east again. Our group, who went from Lura in North Tipperary to Clonfert in East Galway. At the end of the 19th century, we returned back again to Ballymakeegan in County Tipperary. And in my grandmother was a Walcher, and one of the Walshes again left Ireland during the famine. They migrated to Australia. They didn't like Australia. They went on to San Francisco. This was the second generation, Thomas Walsh. He became the leading architect in San Francisco, and many of the notable buildings were designed by him. And many of them survived the Great Earthquake of 1904. And again, I matched this lady here who was his granddaughter. And so that again was a success story in matching. And the Corcoran name, it came from a hereditary family of Aeronauts. Aeronauts were people who lived on monastic land, who managed monastic land. If you remember, at that time, the monasteries owned about 30% of the land in the country. So they needed lay members of that community who did all of the administrative teaching. They also did teaching. They also did maintenance of the churches. They did collection of tithes and so on and so forth. So our family were hereditary Aeronaut family, and they were found clustered around monastic sites. So I did an exercise in looking at the census, the frequency of the Corcoran names, and the locations of the major monastic settlements in Ireland. And there was a one-to-one matching. One of my objectives for next year is to research all of the ecclesiastical or the learned families of Ireland, the Filiads, the poet families, and so on and so forth. And so that's one of my major research tasks for the coming year. And yeah, I want to say, I thought I had another slide in here. It was a project I'm currently working on, which is a Sarsfield project. Many of you will know that Patrick Sarsfield was an Irish hero. He fought on the Jacobite side at the Battle of the Boyne, the Battle of Aughrim, and at Siege of Limerick. The Treaty of Limerick was signed by the forces of William of Orange. The conditions of that treaty was that Sarsfield's army had to leave, and this was the beginning of the wild geese. And so we have identified the resting place of Patrick Sarsfield's in a monastery in Belgium, in the town of Huy. And the mayor of the town has acquired the land with the purpose of excavating the remains and returning them to Ireland. Once they are identified, they will be returned to the French naval frigate, Marechal de France, and my job is to test the surviving Sarsfields or people with Sarsfield name, and I identified the most probable haplogroup belonging to Patrick Sarsfield. And it's quite extraordinary. It's an extremely rare haplogroup. It also matches other Sarsfields, so we have a fair amount of confidence that it is the one for Patrick Sarsfield, and it matches many of the other Cambro-Norman families. These are the Norman families because Sarsfield was a Norman name. They arrived in Ireland with the Normans, with the Fitz, so you had Fitzpatrick, Fitzstevens, Fitzthomas, Fitzgerald, and so on and so forth. So all of the Fitz carry the same very rare mark. Excuse me. And also the Roaches and the Dubards. So that's the main DNA project which I'm researching in the coming year. So with that, I hope I've kept time, and I'm happy to take any questions.